For years, trends across Canada suggested that the social conservative movement was in trouble. But perhaps the movement was down, but not out. Consider the thousands that continue to protest Ontario's new sex ed curriculum, the abiding interest in Trinity Western University, or the significant participation in Patrick Brown's PC leadership campaign. Joining us now as we consider the state of social conservatism in Canada today, Ferris Marish, organizer of the Facebook group Parents Against Ontario Sex Ed Curriculum. David Rayside, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science and Bonham Centre for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. And we welcome back author and journalist Michael Coren. Good to see you again. Ferris, you were just here the other day debating Michael Coren on the sex ed curriculum. I guess it went okay. You're back again.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
We're willing to do it more and more, I guess.
Okay, good. David, haven't seen you in a while, so good to see you again as well.
Nice to be back.
If you're a social conservative in Canada, David, what do you believe?
Oh, you can believe many different things. It is not one thing to be a social conservative. There are some social conservatives who, first of all, there's some that believe more absolutely in a certain set of principles. There are some who might be described as social conservatives who are conservative on particular issues but not on others. So it's a very mixed bag, which is often why it's difficult to talk about it as a whole, because there are many fragments to this, and sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't, and overall they're a weaker force politically than they once were.
Because one of the things, Michael, I'm trying to figure out here is, if you're a social conservative, do you necessarily oppose same-sex marriage? Do you necessarily, are you in favor of capital punishment? Are you necessarily pro-life on the abortion issue? What's the answer to those questions?
Canada is different from the US, and Catholic can be different from evangelical. Most Catholics, even conservative Catholics in this social conservative movement, would oppose the death penalty. It's really the view of Rome, of the Vatican now. But two particular issues, I suppose, define or crystallize the movement. One will be opposition not just to marriage equality, but also to many of the aspirations of the gay community, and also very strongly anti-abortion, and that has now bled into being against euthanasia. Now, being opposed to euthanasia, I think there's far more support for that position in Canada than for the other two. But definitely homosexuality and abortion, at rather an extreme point as well. It's not a point of compromise, it's not a point of conversation, and it's also completely lost. I mean, it's defeated, it was defeated some time ago. I mean, I'll give you an example, the anti-abortion movement. Brown Mulroney had a bill that would have kept abortion as part of the criminal code. Legal after the third month. It doesn't do very much. Most abortions are before that, and doctors can play games with chronology. But they joined with very active supporters of abortion to defeat that bill, all or nothing. So it was absolutely nothing. But social conservatism in Canada, now we've seen a bit of a rebirth over sex education, but generally it's not only moribund, but it's largely pointless. It has very little support in Canada.
Ferris, would you agree?
Absolutely not. It's interesting to see how social conservatism is portrayed to the public as mere blind following of certain codes or principles based on no logic or no proper assessment. And I really need to kind of reintroduce this now. Social conservatism, as any other life management system, is based on the principle of harm and benefit. And we really need to take things back to that principle, harm and benefit. So the way we view harm and benefit is what actually moves us. So as a social conservative, if I would consider myself one, follower of a religion or any traditional values like most of them, those values came across to show us what's harmful and what's beneficial. So that balance is what makes us actually move forward. It's not just desires or feelings or hatred towards a person or an idea. When we look at things, if we put it in that balance and say, is that behavior or action, is it harmful to the individual or to society? We look at physical harm, we look at psychological harm, we look at economical harm. So if we all sit down and think about it and weigh any behavior that's controversial and see, is it harmful or not? Is it beneficial or not? Going through that doors, then it's a completely different argument. It's not just a bunch of group of people that are blindly following an idea or an ideology.
All right, let me follow up with this then, because if you are an adherent of social conservatism and you read the mainstream newspapers of this country, you would have seen some of the following over the last several months. You would have seen, for example, protests over the new sex ed curriculum in Ontario. You would have heard criticisms of Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne's sexual identity. You would certainly be aware of flyers having been distributed featuring pictures of aborted fetuses and Liberal leader Justin Trudeau because of his new position that, well, not so new anymore, that pro-life people are not welcome in the Liberal Party of Canada to run for that party anymore. And you would have seen about 10,000 people participating in the National March for Life on Parliament Hill on May 14th of this year. Does it feel to you, David, like social conservatives are at least getting a lot more attention lately?
Well, it's episodic. I mean, if you look at the data on things like attendance at religious services, if you look at the belief in positions that are typically identified, the rational version of the positions associated with social conservatives, all of those are down, right? But it's true that controversies arise where there's a voice given to people who, some of whom are in fact blind followers, but some of whom have a reasoned analysis representing different values. So there's a whole mix, and sometimes, especially schooling issues have the capacity to really mobilize people, because a lot of people, frankly, are a bit uncertain about what kind of schooling their children should get. So it looks as if there's a kind of resurgence of social conservatism, but it really isn't. There are flashpoints, yes. There's mobilizing of a sizable minority constituency. It's not nowhere. It's not disappeared.
But you're convinced it is only a minority constituency.
Well, there's no doubt that on most of, I'm not saying on all issues, on most of the issues that have mobilized social conservatives in this country for the last 20 years, they're a minority voice.
Yeah. Ferris, I think it's fair to say that for the last 20 years, up until just recently, social conservatism was very much on the run in this country. Not lately. It's certainly in the news more lately. How much power, though, how much influence do you think social conservatives truly have in politics today?
A lot of power. Conservatives follow religions and traditions that have been around for thousands of years. And it's just normal that with that length of a system, many people with less knowledge will become blind followers. And that's when we see kind of a decline in the followers, not only followers, people voicing or expressing openly that they're followers. So some people will shy away. But like anything else, there's a revival. So when new people come in and start rationalizing the basis of social conservatism, there are a lot of people out there that believe in it. It's still in here, it did not go away, but once they see a logical movement coming in, they will stand up and join. And this is exactly what's happening right now, because it's not just about blind following, it's about rationale, it's about logic, it's about common sense. The ones that kind of believe in it, but we really don't know, they're not courageous enough to follow. Now the doors are open, so we'll see a lot more people coming back.
Michael?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to be clear here that this link between religion and social conservatism. For example, at the Pride Parade, you will see a number. I mean, Brent Hawkes told me this some years ago. I didn't believe it until I checked.
Tell the people who he is.
Brent Hawkes, who was a leader of the Metropolitan Community Church, gay church, and that's rather crass, but that was part of its impetus, and I think he was the Grand Marshal of the Pride Parade last year. There are many. I think that the largest number of floats come from religious organizations. The Anglican Church, the United Church, Reform Judaism, most Roman Catholics, I don't think they call themselves social conservatives. Roman Catholics, 44% of this country, how many of them actually oppose same-sex marriage? A minority, I would argue. How many use contraceptives? The vast majority. Yeah. So that link isn't as tangible as you might think. Also, this idea that if you believe in a faith and it goes back 2,000 years, I mean, I believe in a faith that does go back 2,000 years, that doesn't necessarily mean I have to be a social conservative. It does demand I behave in a certain way and believe in a certain way, but not necessarily social conservatism.
Do you still think of yourself as a SOCON?
No, I don't. No, I mean, I wouldn't call myself a conservative either. I mean, I've said for the longest time, Christians shouldn't look left or right, they should look up. I mean, love is a central issue here, and the only things that are black and white are love and grace. As for common sense, I'm sorry, but I have to say this. Having met so many people who oppose the sex education curriculum but have not read the curriculum, I don't construe from that they're taking a common sense, rational position. There's something hysterical about it.
Okay, we don't want to refight this. We're not going to relitigate it because we had you two in here a few weeks ago to do that program already. But I do want to get a better sense of how powerful this movement is. Ferris, I hear you say we have a lot of power today.
Yes.
I'd like you to point to me to one. Just tell me one law that got passed or one law that got stopped from passing because social conservatives flexed their political muscle.
It might not be there yet, but I want to tell you about the coalition that we have for the Parents Coalition, which is getting people from different backgrounds, different religions, and realizing we all have something in common, which is the way we, as I said, we weigh the behavior or the action based on harm and benefit, rooting that logic into our beliefs.
No, I get that, but if you are as powerful as you say you are as a political force, surely there's something you can hang your hat on.
It will. Right now, it's on the rise. And what I'm saying here is a lot of people will follow blindly. Most people will follow any system, not just religion, blindly, because they just want the easy way out. They want someone to make a decision on their behalf. Then there are other people that will follow because maybe they're, intimidated or there's fear. And there is a third type of people that will follow any principle because they're benefiting from it, whether it's financial benefit or what have you. And this shows evident when people change their positions. The question comes here is
that
did you actually, study or understand what you're getting yourself into to have a drastic change in your position? I don't know. Maybe there are other benefits involved.
So what I'm saying, you must let him respond to that.
But what I'm saying,
hang on, you do need to let him respond to that.
If it's becoming a personal attack, it says a great deal, I think, about many. Unless you didn't mean what you said, that sounded very much as though you were attacking me. If you think I'm doing anything for financial benefit, I've lost half my career since I had this. But I don't care about that. But well, if you didn't mean it, of course I will accept that. No. But when you talk about this coalition of religion, the Catholic Church isn't on your side. The Roman Catholic Church will not be officially involved. The Anglican Church will not.
They're intimidated, that's why.
Who are they intimidated by?
Well, for sure. You're talking about a huge, we always hear about revoking the funding for Catholic schools. We always hear about a lot of things out there. There are people, everybody says that. This is not
I don't hear it.
Well, maybe you need to dig deep enough, but everybody,
just so
it's intimidation.
Just so I understand, you are suggesting that Catholic school boards across the province, and I guess by extension the church, won't fight the sex ed curriculum because they're afraid of losing the $9 or $10 billion a year they get to support their schools?
There's definitely fear of loss of maybe power and financial support. Absolutely, it's understandable. The idea here is, can we go through this fight to have enough support? And that's what we're talking about.
David.
Well, I want to step back from this a little bit. I don't want to predict the outcome of the sex ed controversy, but I want to re-ask your question, which is, what's the bigger picture of losses and gains? How do we look at that? One way of looking at that is public opinion. And the shifts in public opinion on the major issues around which social conservatives have organized have been one way in the direction against what they were arguing.
He says so far.
So far, there is not going to be a change in terms of the big picture attitudes towards homosexuality, towards reproduction. There's not going to be a change. In terms of the big picture rates of religious practice, no matter how you measure that, are they going to re-rise? Is there going to be a revival? I don't think so. In terms of policy issues over the last 3-4 decades, sure, there are some issues, and let's not forget this, there are some issues right now in which social conservatives have some capacity to exercise influence, not power, influence. Mm-hmm. But they tend to be smaller scale issues. On the things that mattered most over the last 40 years, they have mostly lost. That doesn't mean they have no influence. It just means if you step back from the details of sex ed, you see a very different picture, and it is not a picture of revival.
Let me pursue that with Ferris. If you look at a lot of the issues that I suspect David is referring to, same-sex marriage, it is clearly going in the direction of acceptance. Mm-hmm. Capital punishment, we're not going to have capital punishment in this country again for a long time, if ever. Ever's a long time, but you know what I'm saying, not for the foreseeable future. Abortion, we've been without an abortion law in this country for almost 30 years, and there seem to be no efforts. If it didn't come back under Stephen Harper with a majority government, it's not coming back. Again, for the foreseeable future. Where's the tangible evidence you can point to that says social conservatism is on the political rise?
Again, we're referring back to the blind understanding of those issues. And what I'm saying here is, if we scale everything with harm and benefit, it becomes easy. When we understand that abortion, it's not absolutely forbidden because just the fact, like the story that you referred to, where there's a rape, definitely there has to be abortion there because the harm is far greater of having that child.
Have you told that to your friends in campaign life? Because they would condemn you. They would not share a platform with you if you said such a thing.
Sure. This is the discussions that are going on. See, again, it's not about blind following. It's about reasoning now. And what we're saying here is, the reason why people are opposing these issues because they believed in their religion, and some of them, they will take it, to an extreme point or saying, no, we can't even think about it. No, we are in an era, and if we go back to the beginning of religion, people had the chance to discuss and reason things. So Now, because we are reasoning, because we are applying proper measures in reasoning and weighing the actions, whatever it is, homosexuality, abortion, whatever it is, we need to reason. Is there greater
Okay.
harm than benefit? And that's what we look at.
Having said that, David, I suspect you have to acknowledge that with the election of Patrick Brown as leader of the Ontario PC Party, that didn't happen without social conservatives flexing their muscles.
That's right.
They did. He signed up a lot of their members and they voted for him.
Yes.
You look at the controversy over the sex ed curriculum happening right now. I mean, that
Yes.
could have gone away and just,
Yes.
you know, Kathleen Wynne's got a majority
Absolutely.
government, could have brought it in easy peasy lemon squeezy, as they say. No, it's a thing. They are a larger force today, you got to confess, right?
They're certainly mobilized. I think I'll wait to see how Patrick Brown leads the party,
Yep.
but one of the first things he did was to say he had no interest in raising social conservative issues because he knows these will blow up in the face of his party as they did with Tim Hudak. And so it doesn't necessarily, it certainly is interesting. What does it mean in the bigger sense? Let's just wait a few years to see how that pans out. Sex ed, there's no question. There is unease about that. There is a lot of opposition to it. I think a lot of it has to do with the specificities of schooling as an issue. And I agree that it's unpredictable. Does that mean, and I know I'm repeating myself, does that mean that social conservatives as a political force are on the rise in Ontario? No, it absolutely does not.
Having said that, Michael, would you not have to grant that recent immigrants to Canada have breathed new life into the social conservative movement?
This is the issue. But I don't think Patrick won because of social conservatism. If you look at the vote that Monty McNaughton had, and he really had the monopoly of the social conservative vote, it wasn't large. Now, he threw his vote in with Patrick. Patrick won because of extraordinary stamina, certain complacency on the part of his main opponent, and also his wonderful contacts with particularly the South Asian community and others, and he did very well. I don't think Patrick, and I've known him for many years, is really a social conservative, but it is immigration. I've been to some of the demonstrations on sex ed. There are some of the usual suspects there, if you like, white Christians, I suppose. But by and large, we're speaking to people from the Chinese Christian community, overwhelmingly members of the Muslim community, Sikhs as well. This coalition has come together. Now, that's where the power is. There are, and I think Patrick is probably one of them, and other political leaders who are realizing they will lose certain ridings unless they can make sure that that ethnic vote, which is implicitly fairly socially conservative, is taken care of, accounted for, catered to. I don't think all of these people are socially conservative. I think many of their children will abandon that position, but at this point they are. So it's temporary, but that is a bit of power. Not that much, but some.
But I think I heard you say it. I mean, in the past 25 years in this country, the social conservative movement has been overwhelmingly white. You look at the Christian Heritage Party, you look at Cardis, the Institute of Marriage and the Family Canada. These are overwhelmingly white organizations.
Oh, yeah.
The face of social conservatism is browning, if I can put it that way,
Very
isn't
much
it?
so. It's very conservative Catholics who've never had a particularly strong relationship or comfortable one with the established Catholic Church, and it's evangelicals, particularly from the Dutch community, but not exclusively. And they have failed at almost everything they've attempted. They've failed. Now, though, there is something different. The numbers are with a different community. I'm not sure if those communities are politically sophisticated. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but the numbers are there and there's a passion, and they have a right to be passionate. We'll see what happens. It's going to change the nature of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, and the NDP in particular doesn't quite know how to react.
Ferris, there is...
I want to jump in here.
Sure.
Because there's a real risk here in characterizing the protest as overwhelmingly brown, and also characterizing immigrant communities as overwhelmingly socially conservative. They are not. It is true that first-generation migrants from areas of the world that themselves are fairly conservative around family issues, yes, no question. Second generation, as Michael said, makes a huge difference for all communities within this country, but particularly for migrant communities. And the the federal Conservative Party, party's attempt to woo minority communities has had very uneven success. Because the so-called conservatism is only on some issues, not on others. The Muslim community, for example, if you ask them in either the United States or Canada about gender issues, not much difference from the rest of society.
Well, let me follow up with Ferris on this. If you go to the United States, the social conservative movement in the U.S. is big. And if you want to be president of the United States and get the Republican nomination, you got to go through the social conservatives, right? They've got to give you the good housekeeping seal of approval. Is it your hope to create a movement in this country that rivals what we see in the United States today? Vetting candidates, vetting issues, all of that kind of thing?
Our hopes is to keep the balance in our society. Because what we see, even on the liberal side of things are moving towards, maybe favoring a certain group or undermining some groups. So what we really want to do is to keep the balance. Canada has always been known for this beautiful balance in maintaining all minorities' interests and rights. So what we feel, especially with the sex education, that's we're kind of tampering with that balance, which becomes dangerous here because people came to Canada so they can preserve their identities and preserve their rights. And all what we're looking for is to maintain that balance.
Just one last question to you, Ferris. Do you feel social conservatives in Canada are demonized?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
By whom?
Absolutely. Well, by the ones that will basically differ with their the social conservative position on certain issues. It prevents some groups from progressing or growing, or it's always been a fight. And if you look at the Human Rights Code, it's always religion against sexual orientation. And we know this.
But you got a private meeting with Premier Wynne.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
pretty hard to do if you're a demonized organization, isn't it?
Well, in demonizing, okay, thank you very much. It could be direct or indirect. And let's just be realistic here. The demonization is indirect. It's done through some media. It's done through loud voices.
Conspiracy.
It's not conspiracy. No, we feel it. We hear it. For God's sake, I went to a play downtown Toronto, a famous play. It's supposed to be a family play, and they're talking about Muslims being terrorists.
Which
part
play?
of the play? It's the Robin Hood play. I was there myself.
It's a panto. What has that got to do with this
What I'm
conversation?
saying, absolutely.
It's not
because
about religion, but
the
the point-
question is the culture and the media could be used to demonize people, but it's not going to be done officially. I mean, let's look at our Prime
Gentlemen,
Minister's
forgive
position.
me. You gotta I'd love to, but we're plumb out of time.
It's a particular construction on religion which doesn't represent most religious Canadians.
Going to invite all three of you back with your theatre reviews for next time, and we'll pick it up from there. David Rayside from the U of T, Ferris Marish, Parents of Ontario, Michael Corin, the author and broadcaster. As always, thanks to the three of you for a great debate tonight at TVO.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.